Well, since Wednesday is Christmas, I thought we would leave our book for a little bit and actually look at a metaphysical interpretation of Christmas. Now, those of you who have been at the Centre of Light a long time obviously have, we've done this before, but for our new people, I thought it would be an interesting way to look at Christmas totally differently. December 25th is a really interesting date. We know that most of the large festivals in the Christian calendar are actually pagan festivals that have been taken over by the church and adjusted to meet the needs of whatever they need in their liturgical calendar. And
They're laughing at me, don't mind them.
We're playing with our animals.
yes, play with your animals, please. I may actually turn this over to the dog.
I'm sorry.
Like this.
Monica, we're just horsing around.
Oh boy, it's going to be a tough morning.
What's your horse's name?
So, December 25th, we know was Saturnalia in the Roman calendar, and so obviously it provided a really nice little holiday to take over, and this meant that when the Christian Church actually wanted to take these things on board, it meant that they didn't have to disrupt too much. They just kind of altered the meaning slightly and changed the names, and everything was able to carry on exactly as it was without much disruption. But when you look at December 25th in particular, there are a number of Christ-like figures in the past that actually were not only born of a virgin, but were also born on December 25th, including Horus, the Ethiopian Sudanese god, about 3,000 years before Jesus. Buddha, about 500 or so years before Jesus. Krishna, 900 years before Jesus. How interesting that they all showed up on December 25th. Zarathustra, they were all born of a virgin and arrived on the same day. Even Hercules, the Greek god, was supposedly another of them. Mithra, the Persian god. Thammuz, a Babylonian god. And you know, there's all these mythological characters that have their similar story. Hermes and others, all following the same pattern. So I thought that was really interesting, how they all used December 25th. It's also a critical time because it is when actually the sun dies. And you can imagine the light is gone, and that was very frightening time of the year for most. But then after 3 days, the sun rose, or started to rise, and of course the light was restored. But we have been led to believe that, or I have, maybe it is just me, that the story, the Christmas story, was fact. That's how I grew up. It was just a factual story of exactly what happened And since it was coming from religion, it had to be true. But one of the really interesting things is that the Christmas story only appears in 2 of the synoptic Gospels, Matthew and Luke. There's no mention of it whatsoever in Mark or John. And they differ. They differ in their content in both Gospels. Matthew traces Jesus' roots back to Abraham to emphasize his role as the Jewish Messiah. Luke traces him all the way back to Adam, emphasizing the enduring importance of his life and his message. Matthew says that the birth was in Bethlehem because that's where Mary and Joseph lived. And then he has them fleeing from Bethlehem to Egypt. Luke says they lived in Nazareth, but then they went to Bethlehem for a census. But I believe there's no record of a Roman census at that time. And obviously, when they got there, they were forced to stay in a stable. Luke has the shepherds. Matthew has the wise men. And over time, it's become merged together to make one story. But even though, excuse me, even though the facts are perhaps not necessarily accurate, and obviously we don't know that, I found it interesting that even the Catholic Church acknowledges that the story should be regarded from different perspectives. Peter Kreeft, who's a prolific Catholic writer on apologetics. Apologetics is a field of Christian theology which aims to present a rational basis for the Christian faith, and it defends the faith against objections. So this Peter Kreeft, he teaches at Boston College in Massachusetts, and he's on the advisory board of the Catholic Education Resource Center. He says, the story of history is composed not only of events, but of words and signs and symbols. This is unfamiliar to us because we've lost a sense of depth and exchanged it for a flat, one-dimensional, bottom-line mentality in which everything means only one thing. Let's try to recapture the riches of this lost world view by applying the spiritual sense of the Christmas story to our lives. For that story happens not only once in history, but also many times in each individual's soul. There are 2 ways to connecting the historical and the spiritual senses. The Jesuit method from St. Ignatius's Spiritual Exercises tells us to imaginatively place ourselves into the gospel stories. The older Augustinian method tells us to look for elements of the story in our lives. In Thou That Art, Transforming Religious Metaphor, Joseph Campbell wrote, when you translate the Bible with excessive literalism, you demythologize it. The possibility of a convincing reference to the individual's own spiritual experience is lost. And that is basically what has happened, because we've all been told that this is a literal story, then there is no connection. So, what do I mean about looking at it from a metaphysical perspective? And there's many of them. And there's many different understandings of that. But we can take our own our own metaphysical perspective, and you can add to it, and we can go from there. So perhaps the child represents our own inner child in all our innocence and vulnerability, stripped of any of the trappings of our everyday lives. Perhaps the image of the baby being born in the lowliest of surroundings reminds us that on a spiritual level, there is no rich or poor, weak or strong. We're all equal. And so, if you think of this not as the annual celebration of the birth of this baby, but the annual rebirth of your own Christ consciousness within, it kind of changes the perspective here. So, let's assume that Mary, the mother of Jesus, represents the feminine, the emotional, feeling side of our nature, while Joseph, the carpenter, is the masculine, pragmatic, thinking side. And obviously the two together provide that balance that we're constantly looking for, the yin and the yang. What about looking at the in as ourselves, our mind? And so we have an awareness that if there is no room at the in, maybe this is indicating that we fill our minds so full of the mundane that there is no space for any kind of spiritual understanding or spiritual thought. The stable reminds us of our connection to nature, as do the shepherds and all the animals. The shepherds, of course, are uneducated, generally. It represents ourselves, still kind of raw and full of wonder still at the world. Because once the education comes along, then many times it actually robs us of that wonder. It steals that from us. The Magi. The word Magi comes from the Greek magos, or magician. Why do you think they were called magicians that came? And we made them kings. Why do you think they did that? No ideas.
Do you think they were like the tricksters and the Cocopellis of the Indian myth, that they were people that were bringing change and something new to that point in time?
Interesting thought.
I think they were the metaphysicians. They were the people of that spiritual, and so you had to make them magic because they had that connection to God and had information that people didn't understand.
That's interesting. Matthew.
Isn't there a story about it being a constellation of 3 bright stars moving into the hemisphere at that time?
Absolutely. Yes.
I
Bonnie.
think it has to do with the validation of what was happening.
Well,
Yeah.
Peggy.
I always thought of it as they were following a star that's nothing from this earth but inspiration from
Heavens.
But the
without.
interesting thing is, they came from the east.
Yes.
The east is the source of light.
Yes.
And light doesn't just refer to what we know, the opposite of dark. Light refers to wisdom and knowledge. You know, think about what we say when you suddenly get or understand something. You go, the light went on. Okay? Yes, Akhilesh.
So I remember reading somewhere or seeing somewhere that the three gifts that they brought symbolize something. So
Yes.
I forget what it was, but there was maybe it was something to do.
Well, the three gifts, if you think about it, they brought gold, frankincense, and myrrh. So were these metaphors for the physical, the emotional, and the spiritual? Gold, of course, is material. And as you know, it's something can be either good or bad. So gold could be used for good, or it could be used to accumulate wealth and push others away. Yes, Mary?
Yeah, and I've read recently too that probably gold was turmeric because it was so valuable. And
There you go.
So it was, yeah.
That's
'Cause
cool.
the rest of them were also.
Which is always
Right, because which is interesting, because the others were
What'd she say, gold was what?
turmeric.
Oh.
Healthy stuff.
That's what I read.
You know,
Very healing.
yeah, absolutely. Frankincense, olibanum, it comes from the boswellia tree. And what happens is that the resin bleeds from the tree, and as it bleeds, it forms what look like tears. But frankincense is used in healing and in religious ceremonies. And I thought, does it represent the healing power that we have within ourselves? And you know, often when we go through the healing process, there's a lot of tears that bring us to that point. So is the symbolism, associated with the emotional side of us, the emotions that have to be right in order for us to heal. And we know that is a fact. It's Louise Hay wrote a book, called Heal Your Body, which was the metaphysical causes of physical illness, the mental causes of physical illness, and the metaphysical way to heal them. Yes, Akhilesh.
So here's a question that I've been thinking of as we talk about this. So all of these figures were born on a certain day, and then they were born of virgins. So are these predestined figures that show up, or is this birth thing created after the fact, in the sense that does every few thousand years, every few hundred years, do we create someone's birth circumstance, or does the birth circumstance actually happen?
How interesting. What do you think?
Fair question.
We don't know. We don't know.
Thank
I
you,
know,
Rob.
but I
think it's just designed to make them, that they're special.
Well, the virgin birth notion is to indicate that they are more pure. They come in with clarity.
During that part of history and from other teachings, we always have a virgin birth, because when you menstruate, you clean out the uterus, and so the uterus is ready for a new birth. So every birth is a new birth because we have a new uterus.
Interesting.
Wow.
Yes.
Uh,
Akhilesh?
So I was just thinking, so if all of these people were born in such similar circumstance,
Yes.
it seems somewhat contrived, in the sense, it would be very coincidental if so many people were born exactly the same way. So if you go by that, then it seems that all of these birth circumstances are myths that are created after the fact.
Right.
So if you go with that, then what is the reason for that? I don't know. Is it something, I don't know what it is.
That's interesting. Yes.
I'm going to leave the virgin birth out of my conversation
Yes.
and talk about the Christ consciousness and the Buddha and everybody else you mentioned. I read somewhere, I don't remember where, that on a purely spiritual level, there is a belief out there that the soul that incarnated in Jesus and all of these other people is the same entity, reincarnated over and over and over and over and over and over.
Okay, that's
And
enough.
it started
You
with
mean like regular
Adam.
people?
Well, you know,
Well,
but
yeah,
again,
Jesus was a real person.
but again, you know,
Just was
it's
like a shaman.
the Adam and Eve, the creation myth.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Yes, Akilai.
I remember watching a video, which we can all watch, I think, called Zeitgeist or something, which,
Yes.
which sort of explains all of these births as somehow linked to our astrological
Right.
sort of, where the sun moves around, its twin star, and so on. And
Yes.
so every time there's an age, like there was the age of the bull, and I think Mitra was part of that.
Yes.
And then there's the age of Pisces, which is Jesus.
Jesus,
And
right.
then the age of Aquarius is
Aquarius.
coming, and so
Yeah.
so maybe this birth is meant to symbolize the new age.
Ooh, that's another
And
really.
That's what they said. It's not my
That's-
theory.
No, well, hey, own it.
Yeah, I'm with Akilai on this, and also is that repeating cycle as we need it
Right.
for our spiritual growth that comes about. There is in the end of the Seth Chronicles, there is a Seth channeling too that really
Yeah.
speaks of the birth of Jesus and what actually his channel of what he says what actually happened, and the coming again of this new for the new age, a
Right.
new consciousness, and you know the channelers that we listen to and put some stock in, they all kind of say the same thing. It's cyclical.
Right.
And it's ours too, as we cycle through our lives and come to certain points.
Right.
Then we are creating a new, like we're creating a new world right now
Absolutely.
all around us.
But I read that it was really interesting that we celebrate Jesus' birth. And generally, I think it is the only birth that we celebrate of these religious and spiritual figures. Normally, we celebrate their feast day or whatever is their day of death.
Right, yeah.
John?
It's very confusing because you have to keep in mind that who told you the story. You know, the writer of the story is going to put their slant on it,
Well, yes.
which is what
But,
Catholic Church or
you know, when I was growing up, I was completely unaware that the Christmas story was a combination of pieces from two different Gospels, because I grew up believing that the Gospel was the absolute truth, and therefore if it was there, then that's how it was. But then you find this Gospel says this, and this Gospel says that. So in order to overcome the fact that there are discrepancies between the two, they just all got together,
well, I
and they're
mean,
one story.
they're trying to head fake you to get away from what's real. Is that Christ can become born in you?
That's what I think the Christmas season is all
It's
about.
rebirth for yourself.
It's the rebirth of the Christ consciousness within.
And the rebirth of nature.
Right.
21st is a rebirth of nature.
Yeah, it is the
solstice.
Yeah.
reawakening at the
Mhm.
solstice. Yes. Yes, Akinash.
So what I find interesting is that you have these real historical figures, all of them that you mentioned, Buddha, Christ,
Right.
Mitra, who actually had major spiritual impact on
Mhm.
the planet. And then you
Yes.
have the stories of their birth, which seem to be mythological.
Uh-huh.
And their lives almost seem to have this myth around them. And in many cases, they are used as control mechanisms by religions
Absolutely.
over time. But that's a different issue. But what I find interesting is that you have these real figures who have real spiritual impact, and then you have their birth, which is a myth. And I'm trying to figure out what is the point of this myth of the birth sort of repeating itself? Because I think if you grow up Christian, then you believe that this only happened one time.
Right.
But once you understand that it happened many times, the same
Yes.
story,
Yes.
then you realize it's a myth, and then
Mhm.
you start wondering why is that.
That's
I mean, what's
very
the
interesting. Yes.
I would suggest that perhaps with all of these figures who lived human lives and made a spiritual impact on the world, that in order to embellish, make them more grand, make them more godlike, make them even more special, the myth was developed around them. They were special, they were shamans, they were whatever, but it makes them even more godlike.
Matthew.
So, I think that there's only one constant for us here on earth, to look out at the heavens. Then they continue in the cycle. And humans, where we come from, at one point, when we stopped looking down, we looked up, and different members of the tribe had different capabilities. We had good hunters, we had good caretakers, we had good... There was this one person who was extremely observant, and whether or not they used it for good or evil, they saw these cycles going on in the sky, and maybe if you're a cynical person, you say that this person went to the rest of the tribe and said, if I don't have the best whatever in the village tomorrow, I'm going to make the sun go away, or the day is going to be long, or whatever.
I saw that movie.
And so all of these stories, every single one of them, can be traced back to the cycles moving in the sky. There's nothing original about them except the different elements that humans ascribed to them. So it's a continual story. It's not an original story.
No.
That's why there's so many things in line with it.
The repetition
Right,
in
it
the
goes-
sky would explain why we repeat this
The birth.
over and over and over.
Right.
Yeah. That's an interesting way of looking at
Well,
it.
yeah, and they're
Yeah.
saying, every myth has a base of truth
Oh,
somewhere.
yes, absolutely.
It's just like
Uh-huh.
when you play,
Western
what is it,
Europe.
like the telephone game, or
Yes.
the gossip, where somebody
Yes.
starts something and then it
That's-
gets elaborated.
That's
and
a really
elaborated.
good way of looking at it. Is actually we start with the basic story,
With
and
basic
then just
truth,
like Hilda's suggesting with the telephone game, in every retelling, it either gets distorted or it gets added to, or the bit you don't like, you take out. You know?
Yeah, that's true.
You see?
Oh,
Yes,
I have a
Adrian.
question. This may be off topic, but the Gospels were written by the apostles.
Uh-huh.
The apostles.
Yeah,
They were all fishermen and illiterate and couldn't write.
right.
So how did it happen that they wrote all these books?
Well,
I mean, what did
this
they-
Well, some of them were 300 years after.
Yeah,
right.
The
How did that-
closest one, I believe, is Mark, who was written. It was written 70 years after Jesus' death. Now, that being the case, if it was written 70 years after Jesus died, and you assume that Jesus and his apostles were all roughly the same age, then that would mean that Mark was 103 when he sat down and wrote it.
Okay, so
And the other thing is they're described as the synoptic gospels. In other words, they were seen and they were witnessed. But when it's written 300 years after, You know, so it's done, as Hildy says, through the vehicle of
Oral history.
oral history being passed along. And so what do you do with oral history? Exactly what we've just said. You know, it gets distorted, added to,
And then you throw in the peace version.
yes.
So I just want to bring a bigger time perspective here. So if you look at at least from Hinduism, there's the concept of the 24,000-year cycle that
Right?
the sun goes through, where we have the four yugas, right? The
Yes.
four epochs. So according to that cycle, right now we have around 1700 we moved from the Iron Age, which is the lowest, when mankind's consciousness is the lowest,
Yes.
to the next level, which is the Bronze Age, and that's when man starts discovering, or not discovering but rediscovering magnetism, electricity, and so on, which
Yes.
sort of roughly corresponds to the Renaissance as we know it.
Right?
And so now we're in the Bronze Age and we're making all this technological progress. The next up will be the Silver Age, and then the Golden Age, where potentially we'll start
Reach
living
the
hundreds.
pinnacle of
We'll be living hundreds of
consciousness.
years. We'll be totally unified, and so on. So
Yes.
it's possible that these myths, these birth myths, are helpful when mankind is at in the Iron Age, when our consciousness is at its lowest because of the sun's cycle. So
Okay.
because they lead to a sort of a separation consciousness, where you're taught to sort of view God as this being that must be worshipped and separate from you.
Right.
And I think all of these monotheistic religions came out of that, and they sort of represented an evolution back towards unity consciousness, which we are moving towards now.
Yes.
And I think technology is helping us with that.
Right.
So maybe we don't need these myths anymore as we evolve up until the next cycle. You see what I mean?
It may be.
Yeah.
Maybe this explains why people are moving away from, the churches. Maybe this explains why, people are no longer getting the spiritual nourishment that they need, because this stuff has been presented as being absolute fact. Yes,
I would
Kathy?
argue that they're not getting the religious dogma that they once needed. They're getting different spiritual nourishment, a lot of people.
Well, yes, but I'm talking within the framework of the church.
Oh, yeah.
Because I think you've hit the nail on the head. That when all you do is keep people controlled with dogma, with fear, we have come to a place, an evolutionary place, where that can't go on anymore. Part of that is the internet. The internet, which provides us with so much knowledge. But you have to be careful, because there's a huge amount of disinformation out there as well. And so you have to look for the balance. Yes, Matthew?
So an argument could be made that science and information technology is the new religion. As we throw off the old dogmas, what the
Interesting.
new bondage will be is the science is
Absolutely.
settled,
Your
the
phone will be the
the
bond.
Yes.
information is
And what we're
Already done.
finding is that
Or your
when
iPad.
there are truths, science is actually backing them up. That wonderful saying that's always attributed to Wayne Dyer, but I believe it was Glasser
It was
who
last
said
year.
it first. When you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. We now know through quantum physics that this isn't just, an ideology. It isn't just a way of thinking that when you change the way you look at things, the things you look at change. It is actually a physical thing that happens when you look at an atom.
It changes.
It changes its behavior. Yes, Ruth Ann.
Well, I was just thinking about what Matthew said, and I just thought, well, when the day comes and they tell us that the internet was initially discovered on December 25th.
The guy that invented it was born of a virgin birth.
Yes, absolutely. Then we're there.
The robot's the virgin.
did have a virgin birth.
Pam.
There's no sex involved.
Back to Lash's point about going into the Bronze Age, that we're in the Bronze Age, we're
Yes.
out of the Kali Yuga. Part of that Bronze Age also is the restoration of the mysteries. And so in this way, I think that
Thank
maybe
you.
we no longer need myth, but we need some of those allegories and symbols that were embedded with those ancient mysteries.
I agree.
Because adepts and people much wiser than us spiritually left those symbols for us to find
Absolutely.
truth. It's embedded in them.
Yes, Mary.
I agree with Pam. I think that we will always need myth in some form.
I agree.
No matter how we evolve.
Yes.
That it is because within every cycle of evolution there are nothing is a straight line.
No.
Everything is, up and down, and so
Yes.
in those lower periods we are gonna need our myths.
We are.
was meant to be.
And why?
It was meant
Um,
to be.
Can you do that again?
One
No mistake.
Okay, so one of the
Does that mean we
things,
can't have Christmas?
one of the, one of the
At
things,
Christmas. We
one
have
of
trees.
the elements we haven't covered yet
Beautiful tree.
is, so what does King Herod represent?
King Herod would be the controlling force.
Yeah.
Okay.
evil side, the element of, I wouldn't want to say sin, but the darkness.
How about the thinking mind? Because
That's
when you're
Joseph.
limited to the thought,
Okay.
you're not going to change.
What about the ego?
Achilles likes it.
And what happens?
I would say-
Surprised
I
he
would
didn't
say-
say that.
And what
It's
happens?
egoless day.
What happens when the ego is threatened with change? It wants to kill off anything, get rid of anything that will disrupt what is comfortable for the ego. And so he asked the wise men to give him the location of the Christ child so that he could then kill off what was threatening. So if Herod represents the ego, you can see how all of these things in this one little story relate to us, who we are, what's going on, even today. Yes. Oh, just moving your arm. Yeah.
I just want to, there's another analogy which is, so like in Hinduism you have consciousness at the top of your head, which is Shiva.
Right.
You have his wife Parvati, the feminine energy at the base of your spine. That's your
Okay.
Kundalini energy. And as it rises up, your ego is the one that sort of keeps them separate. So that could happen here, where you have the feminine, the masculine, and Jesus represents the consciousness ascending, the Christ
Right.
consciousness. And the ego is the one that sort of tries to keep it away. So
Herod is the one
Right.
that is wanting to, being the ego, is to destroy the rising consciousness.
Maintain this time.
Because what happens when consciousness rises?
Change.
disrupts.
Enlightenment.
We change.
Kills the
But
ego.
how do we change?
For the better, hopefully.
Our ego becomes more sublimated.
Our ego becomes more sublimated.
Yes.
And one of the ways that we can be controlled is when the ego is out of control. It is motivated by fear. And as you begin to mediate the ego, to control your own ego, then you can be less controlled by fear. That's what the rise in consciousness is about. And as we rise in consciousness, then our ego tends to get more balance. Remember, we need our ego. Our ego's about survival. That's the thing. This notion that you kill the ego it doesn't work. We need it. That's why we have it.
We minimize it. That's
So-
what I do.
Monica, I'd like
Yes.
to say something. Tom
Yes, of course,
Carpenter,
Maria.
who some of you might know, who is a well-known Course in Miracles teacher around the world, and always taught us that we tend to want to separate ourselves from the ego, or not like the ego, or feel resistance, but that we need to learn to love the ego just like every other part of who we are. It's not something that we're trying to
That's a good point.
release or make go away, or any
Yes.
of those kind of negative connotations.
Keep it in its place.
Yes. The other thing is that Christmas time is associated with light. And I believe that this is part of the way that control was used, this fear of the dark, of the sun dying. Because light is necessary for all aspects of life. Light and life go hand in hand. That is the whole thing. And so what happens at Christmas time, and has always happened, people cover their churches, their businesses, their homes with lights. And all the while we're doing this, and we're not really thinking about the symbolism of what is going on here. This was a motivation from fear. We had to make sure the light was there. And of course, the winter solstice is that time when the light dies. And you know, Jesus said, "I am the light of the world." That was in Matthew 5:14. In John, 9. But in Matthew 5:14 he says, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden, and neither do people light a lamp and put it under a bowl. Instead, they put it on a stand, and it gives light to everyone in the house. In the same way, let your light shine before men." Bless you. And so, perhaps another facet of this season is to make us aware of our own inner light, to get us to pause, reflect, and look within. It's a wonderful time, if you think of it in those terms, as an opportunity to review where we are spiritually, to feel that rebirth of our own spiritual source within, but also as a time to resolve when to keep our light on a stand, to be a beacon of hope for others. Because remember, light also means knowledge. So it's actually giving other people permission to be able to step outside of this story, to see it as something symbolic, to look within and realize that perhaps this is a story about you and the rise of your consciousness, or the rebirth of your consciousness within. Yikes. We're running out of time. And because it is Christmas, I thought that we would finish today with a prayer. And so, Divine Creator, thank you for bringing us together as a spiritual family today and every day. Thank you for giving us a place to be able to express our thoughts, our feelings, and our vulnerabilities without fear of criticism or rejection. And thank you for the safe environment to nurture the rebirth and growth of our spiritual selves. And as we leave this place today, let us be guided by the star from the east, choosing to see the light in everyone we encounter, and sharing our light with those whose light has dimmed, especially at this time of year. Help us to know always that we are loved, and to keep the fear that creeps in at bay by having faith that we are never alone. Let us be aware of the responsibility we have to encourage the light to grow within ourselves and others, not just at Christmas, but every day of the year. And so it is.